In this position, we're queen down, but there's one genius winning move. By the end of this video, you'll be able to find it using 5 calculation techniques, which I'm going to demonstrate now. The first thing to do when calculating is find candidate moves. Candidate moves are your short list of the most promising moves in the position. Once you have your list, you calculate each move until you find the best one or a winning move. In this position, we have an endgame where we're a pawn down. White has 2 big connected passed pawns, but lucky for us, the pawns are stopped by our pieces. White doesn't have any threats in this position, and it's our move, so we have the initiative. But since we're a pawn down, if we play slowly, White's just going to be better. So coming back to candidate moves, we want to find moves that attack White and create problems for White using our initiative. So candidate moves that I would consider in this position, I would consider attacking the king with rook b1 and bishop c4. I would also consider, can I advance my king? So let's start by calculating these moves. If we play rook b1 check, the king will run to e2, and we don't really have any follow-up. Similarly, bishop c4 check, the king could run to e1, and there's no real follow-up after bishop c4 check. King g4 isn't actually threatening anything immediate, and White could advance the king, get the king into a more active position, and again, the initiative's fading. So, coming back to this position, if all of our candidate moves are no good, we can go back to the drawing board and look for new candidate moves, and we can use what we've just learned. So one of the key things we've learned is that this king is escaping out from e2. Now, can you find a candidate move which stops that? How about bishop to f3? Here I'm controlling both squares, and now I'm creating the big threat of rook to b1, checkmate. This king has to run. If he runs to g1, it's no good because he gets checkmated in the corner. So he needs to run to e1. Now if we check, the king runs to d2, and we check again, the king is escaping. So rook b1 check's no good. So do we have an improved move to keep the king in the cage? How about rook d3? And now rook d1 check is unstoppable, and his king can't escape on d2. Candidate moves are essential to organize your calculation and also save time when you do. Our second technique is to always include checks, captures, and attacks in our candidate moves, for the simple reason that they tend to be great moves. Now, in this position, checks, captures, and threats that we have are rook takes h3, rook takes g2, queen takes f2, queen f4 check, queen e5 check, and queen takes d5. There's quite a few, so let's get calculating. Now, if I play rook takes h3, he needs to take with g takes h3. And now I can follow up with checking and taking the pawn. And they're both similar because after the king will run to h1. And now we could repeat with checks, but there's no way for us to force the attack through and checkmate him. The next candidate move we had was rook takes g2 check. And now he has 2 ways to recapture. He can't run away because it's just checkmate. And if king takes, there's mate in 1 with queen takes h3. And rook takes only helps him survive one more move, because after queen takes h3 check, king g1, queen h1 is checkmate. Always calculate checks, captures, and attacks because they might be the winning move. Going back to the starting position, if you didn't focus on checks, captures, and attacks, it will be very, very difficult to find the winning move, rook takes g2. Calculate forcing moves first is our third technique and is essential for being an efficient calculator. Forcing moves are moves where your opponent only has limited options, which makes them much easier to calculate. So, looking at this position, we've got equal material with a nice space advantage and also threat towards the black king. So going back to candidate moves, what candidate moves do we have? Let's start with checks, captures, and threats. This knight has 3 captures. This bishop has a capture. And a big threat that we could make is queen to h5, threatening checkmate in 1 with queen takes h7. Now, the question is, which moves should you calculate first? Well, we already said forcing moves. Which moves are the forcing moves here? Knight takes on these options gives black multiple ways to recapture. If we play Queen h5, there's g6 and f5 for black to defend, and we would have to calculate both. But our final candidate move, bishop takes h7, doesn't give black any options, because if he plays king h8, not only is he a pawn down, but after queen h5, he's in big trouble. So we essentially force him to play king takes h7. And now the follow-up of the attack will most likely be queen h5 to bring the queen into the attack. King has to be forced back to g8 again, and this is the key moment that we need to look at. How can we checkmate the black king? In these attacking positions, it's always really important to try and use as many pieces as possible. So which piece can we bring in quickly? This rook on f1 looks like it wants to get into the action. So rook f3, and we're bringing in the boy. Rook comes to h3, and there's not going to be a way to stop this checkmate down the h file. The only way he can really try to escape is some sort of pawn move with f6, but now we can be very smart and play g6, keeping this blocked off and also threatening queen h7 checkmate. Calculating takes a lot of time, and if we had started with knight takes c6 or knight takes d7, we would still be calculating what's going on after this position. By calculating forcing moves first, it can save you a lot of time, because calculating those forcing moves are much easier, and they often are good moves. Technique number 4 is the secret to calculating deeper. In a game situation, we can't move the chess pieces when calculating, so we need to use our visualization. Get into the habit of imagining the pieces moving in your head. Looking at this position, it looks like we're in trouble because white has 2 huge connected passed pawns. And in terms of candidate moves, there's not much that looks good. But if you've seen this theme before, there's a breakthrough, which is that we can create our own passed pawn using a4. Now, we're going to practice our visualization, and this is something you should get into the habit of doing, because the more you practice, the better you get. And instead of moving the pieces, we're going to try and visualize the pieces moving and imagine the position. So after a4, if he doesn't take the pawn, on our next move we'll push the pawn to a3. And this king is not going to be able to stop both our passed pawn on e5 and our pawn on a3. What that means is after a4, we're essentially forcing him to take a4, b takes a4, and now the idea is to play b3 and push the b3 pawn forward. Now after b3, in order to stop the pawn on b3, this king has to retreat. If we push the pawn again, the king is going to come and mop up the pawn. So we need to find a better move after king to d3. Now, that one passed pawn isn't going to win us the game, but here we have 2 passed pawns, and what we need to do is play e4 check. And now this king is unable to stop both passed pawns. If he comes for the b3 pawn, we'll push again. If he takes the e4 pawn, we're going to push b2. So when you have these positions, try and visualize as much as possible. It's a muscle. The more you practice it, the better you get. Our final technique is what helped me to become an international master, which I learned from my Indian chess friends. It's called find the defense, break the defense. When calculating your own candidate move, find the defense to it, and then once you found the defense, find a way to break that defense. This is how brilliant ideas are formed. So here there's a very obvious candidate move of knight takes g5, winning the queen, and we need to find a defense for black. And well, black's defense is rook to e1 check, and after captures and captures, it's checkmate. So knight takes g5 is not a good candidate move, and we need to find a way to break the defense. Now, the interesting thing that we know is that his defense is to do with rook to e1 checkmating us. So one smart idea that we could have is we could take the rook first, and then after he recaptures, then we take the queen. And then we'll be a rook up, because we've taken the rook before taking the queen. But again, we need to iterate and we need to find the defense, break the defense. So after queen takes e4, we need to imagine if we're playing black, what would we do as black to defend this position? We know that we can't just recapture the queen and let him take the queen next. And that's when you find this really smart intermediate move from black, which is that before recapturing the queen, we're going to sacrifice the queen for a rook so that we do as much damage as possible before losing the queen. So after queen takes e4, queen takes c1, rook takes c1, and then rook takes e4, you end up in essentially an endgame where it's probably slightly worse for white because of all this activity. So going back to the position, we know that knight takes g5 is no good because of the defense rook e1, and we try to break the defense with queen takes e4 followed by knight takes g5, but he's got the intermediate move queen takes c1. So is there a way for us to break the defense? Is there another candidate move that we can find to break this defense? And what we need to do essentially is capture something with the queen with check. And this should have been one of our candidate moves, which is queen takes f7. And after king takes f7, knight takes g5 is check. And will be an exchange up. Alternatively, if the king runs away to h8, we now can use the same idea that we had before, which is to sacrifice this queen for a rook. And the difference is now it's check, and then he doesn't have time to play queen takes c1. So find the defense, break the defense. So now you have all 5 techniques. It's time to calculate like a master and find a genius move to win a queen down. Now let's start with finding candidate moves in this position. And remember, we should consider all checks, captures, and threats. So bishop c5 check, bishop g5 check. We've got rook checks on d7, rook check on e8. And we've got some captures, rook takes g8, rook takes c8, and rook takes g8, as well as bishop takes h6. That's quite a few moves. Now, the trick that we discussed was calculate forcing moves first. So in terms of the most forcing moves here, there's quite a few replies for a number of our moves. But if we play bishop to c5 check or rook to e8 check, he is essentially forced in terms of his response. So let's start with bishop c5 check. And by the way, we're going to practice visualization by not moving the pieces. Just really try to imagine the pieces moving and get into that habit of practicing. So if we play bishop c5 check, the king has to run to e6. And now, in order to follow up with the attack, we could try to bring this knight in on c7, or we could even bring this rook over to e8. But can you find the defense that black will play after that? Well, essentially, the king is going to run to f5, and once the king gets to f5, there's no way we're going to checkmate it because he has all of these squares, and we're queen down. So we found the defense for black, and it revolves around the king running to f5. Find the defense, break the defense. And linking it back to our candidate moves, is there a way to, are there any candidate moves that stop him from running here? Potentially knight c7, but remember we calculate forcing moves first. If we play rook to e8, then his king is further away from this escape route, and it's a forcing move. He has to take on e8. Now, are there any forcing follow-ups after king takes e8? We need to bring in more pieces to attack if we're going to win this game. We've only got 3 pieces left. Well, this knight needs to do something. The knight can come to c7 with check. And now the king has 2 squares. He can go to f8 or he can go to e7. If he comes back to e7, now we play bishop c5. And it's actually checkmate because the difference is the knight is controlling e6. So instead of king to e7, he has to play king to f8. But if we do the same thing, bishop c5, check, knight e7, now there's a final checkmate, which is rook to d8. So let's just play those out for you. Check, checkmate, or king f8, bishop c5, knight e7, and a beautiful rook d8 checkmate. It doesn't matter that we're a queen and a piece down.